this is Sahiti on behalf of Edureka, and I welcome you to this session on Spring Boot interview questions. In this session, guys, we'll mainly focus on the top questions asked related to Spring Boot. So on that note, let's get started with today's session. So without wasting any further time, let's take a look at the topics for today's session. So the topics for today's session are really simple. We'll start this session by understanding why should you use Spring Boot, and then I'll tell you about the job trends of Spring Boot. After that, we'll get into the main topic for today's session, that is the top 50 Spring Boot interview questions. So let's get started then. But before that, I would like to request all of you to subscribe to our Edureka YouTube channel to get daily notified on the top trending technologies. So let's start with the first topic for today's session, that is why should you use Spring Boot? Now, why do you think you have to use Spring Boot? Well, if I talk about Spring Boot, then let me tell you that Spring Boot comes from Spring Framework, and obviously that is related to Java, right? So anybody who's aspiring to become a Java developer, maybe a Spring Boot Java developer, then he or she must have a good understanding about how you can use Spring Boot and how it makes our life easy, right? So if you ask me why should you use Spring Boot, then the reasons are as you can see on my screen. Well, Spring Boot provides stability. It is based on the Java virtual machine. It provides good connectivity. It is cloud native. It has good flexibility and is open source, right? So talking about stability first, I would say Spring Boot is stable as the core and the central models in the Spring ecosystems are for a long time and most changes are backward compatible. So what I mean by that is that, even if Spring Boot is releasing any specific change, right, it announces that particular change a long back before so that, all the applications that are built based on Spring Boot can get updated automatically, right? So in this way, it provides a smooth migration path of your application and makes sure that, there's no problem in the working of the application. Coming to the next factor, that is Spring Boot is based on the Java virtual machine. As we all know that, Spring is Java based, right? So when I said Spring Boot, you should understand that, it comes from Spring and Spring is completely based on Java, right? So since Spring is based on Java and thus obviously it depends on the Java virtual machine, right? Now, in any application, if you talk in real life in the industries, any application can be based on Java, right? Any kind of application, either from a small web application to a to-do application, any kind of application can be based on Java, right? So there's no doubt in the fact that, Java and JVM have proven themselves of running mission critical applications for over 20 years now, right? Also, if we talk, then Spring Boot apps can be developed in the JVM language with being Java and Kotlin as first-class citizens in the Spring ecosystems. Coming to the next factor, that is connectivity. So what I mean by connectivity is that, Spring makes it very easy for you to connect with the relational databases, NoSQL databases, or even queue services, or you can just understand that, it makes it easy to connect with any data access technologies, right? So Spring basically supports Oracle, PostgreSQL, MySQL, MongoDB, Redis, and so on, right? So if you just have to connect to any kind of database, then Spring Boot is your go-to solution. After connectivity, we have cloud native. So what I mean by cloud native is that, Spring Boot follows the deployment principles of cloud applications and is ready for the cloud out of box. So basically with Spring Boot and Spring Cloud together, you can build distributed systems in an easy manner, right? So whenever you want to build large critical applications and then you have to use a cloud service for your storage and all, you can always go forward and use Spring Cloud with Spring Boot and build your distributed systems. Also, whenever you build that application, what happens is that, you can run it on your server, virtual machines, or even containers, or maybe even host on any cloud provider like, AWS, Azure, and so on. So basically, guys, Spring Boot comes with all these features. Coming to flexibility, when I say flexibility, what I mean by that is that, Spring Boot allows you to develop typical server-side rendered web applications, RESTful services, other web APIs, or even create batch jobs and regular command line applications in an easy manner, right? So basically with Spring Boot, guys, you can create any kind of application that you wish to, starting from a simple web API to a command line tool, to a command line application, or even a large scale web application, right? So that was about flexibility. And coming to the last point, that is open source. I think all of us understand that, Spring Boot can be easily downloaded and then you can use Spring Boot in your applications and build the applications in an easy manner, right? Basically, it is just free to use and you can make sure that, your applications can rely on Spring Boot. So if someone asks you why you should use Spring Boot, then here are your reasons. It provides stability. It's based on JVM. It provides good connectivity, that is basically connecting with databases. It's cloud native. It has good flexibility and it's definitely open source. So I hope that you've understood why you should use Spring Boot, right? Now, multinational companies are using Spring Boots for their small applications to big applications. So obviously, when these companies are using Spring Boot, They need developers who can work on Spring Boot. So on that note, next in this session, let's look at the salary trend of a Spring Boot developer. So when I say Spring Boot developer, please don't stick around to that, is only respective Spring Boot. So as you can see in my screen, in United States, a Java developer, or you can just understand that, a Java Spring Boot developer earns around $100K, guys. So that's a huge number per year, right? So that's a big number. So not just with respect to Java Spring Boot developer, but I would just say that, if you go for a Java developer role, which is quite a popular role, then you'll see that, Spring Boot and Spring is one important framework that organizations are looking for, right? So if you're someone who is aspiring to become a Java developer or maybe a Spring Boot Java developer, then I think I can help you with this session on interview questions and make you get prepared for the top questions that are asked related to Spring Boot, right? So on that note, let's get started with the main topic for today's session, that is Spring Boot interview questions. So starting with question number 1, what do you think are the differences between Spring and Spring Boot? Now this is something very simple question, guys, that obviously when I say that Spring has come from Spring Boot, many people have this confusion between what exactly Spring is and what exactly Spring Boot is. Well, let me clear the confusion for you. Well, Spring is just a web application framework based on Java, and Spring Boot is a module of Spring. Coming to Spring, it provides tools and libraries to create customized web applications, whereas Spring Boot is basically used to create a Spring application project which you can just run or execute. Talking about the complexity level, I would say Spring is more complex than Spring Boot, and obviously Spring Boot is less complex than Spring because it provides various kinds of annotations which makes your life easy, right? So when you start using Spring Boot, you understand that if you have to do some tasks, then you already have a predefined annotation for it. You just have to import that particular annotation and then set the required parameters, and then you're good to go. So in that way, Spring Boot is less complex than Spring. And coming to the fourth point, that Spring takes an unopinionated view, whereas Spring Boot takes an opinionated view of the platform. So if someone asks you the differences between Spring and Spring Boot, then make sure that you mention that Spring is a web application framework based on Java, whereas Spring Boot is a module of Spring. And the other difference is it provides libraries to create an application, whereas Spring Boot basically is used to create a Spring application project. So guys, these are the basic differences between Spring and Spring Boot. You can also answer the interviewer, how a particular application can be built, and then what are the difficulties that you face in Spring and how they are overcome in Spring Boot, right? So I hope that you've understood the differences between Spring and Spring Boot. On that note, let's look at the second question, that is, what is Spring Boot and what is the need for it? So if you ask me what is Spring Boot, what I would answer is that, Spring Boot is basically a Spring module which aims to simplify the use of Spring framework for Java development. So if you're building applications, then basically Spring Boot should be your go-to solution. So Spring Boot is basically used to create a standalone Spring-based applications which you can just run, and it aims at rapid application development, right? So if you want big critical applications in a fast manner, and then you want to make sure that that it works perfectly fine, and then you don't want to include a lot of libraries, but you just want to use annotations, then Spring Boot is your go-to solution. So if you ask me what is the need of it, I would just say that Spring Boot comes with auto dependency resolutions, embedded HTTP servers, auto configuration, management endpoints, and Spring Boot CLI, which makes the life of a developer very easy to build an application. So that was about what is Spring Boot and what is the need of it, guys. Let's move on to the next question. What are the advantages of Spring Boot? Well, the advantages of Spring Boot are quite a number. But if you ask me to name a few, then I would say Spring Boot provides auto configuration to load a set of default configuration for a quick start of the application. It creates standalone applications with a range of non-functional features that are common to large classes of projects. It also comes with embedded Tomcat server, servlet containers, and Jetty to avoid the usage of WAR files, which is the big thing now because nobody wants to use WAR files for their applications. Spring Boot also provides an opinionated view to reduce the developer's effort and simplify the Maven configurations. It provides CLI tool to develop and test applications. It also comes with Spring Boot starters to ensure dependency management and also provides various security metrics. It consists of a wide range of APIs for monitoring and managing applications in the development side and also on the prod side. And finally, it also integrates with Spring ecosystem like Spring JDBC, Spring ORM, Spring Data, Spring Security, and makes it easy to avoid the boilerplate code, right? So guys, these are the various advantages of Spring Boot. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, mention few features of Spring Boot. So if you ask me to mention few features of Spring Boot, what comes first onto my mind is Spring CLI. For any tool that you use that is basically the GUI, CLI is something that fascinates everyone. So the first feature that I would say is Spring CLI. So Spring Boot CLI basically allows you to write your code in Groovy for writing Spring Boot applications and also avoid boilerplate code. The next feature that I think is the starter dependency. So with the help of the starter dependency that Spring Boot provides, Spring Boot aggregates common dependencies together and eventually improves productivity on a large scale. Coming to the next feature, that is Spring Initializer. Well, Spring Initializer is basically a web application which can create an internal project structure for you. So you basically do not have to set up the structure of the project yourself. Instead, you can just use this feature and set the structure for you. Coming to the next feature, that is auto configuration. Well, the auto configuration feature of Spring Boot helps in loading the default configuration according to the project that you're working on. So basically in this way, you again avoid the WAR files. Coming to Spring Actuator. Well, this feature basically provides help while running Spring Boot applications. And finally, coming to the last feature, that is logging and security. Well, the logging and the security feature of Spring Boot ensures that all the applications made using Spring Boot are properly secured, and then all the factors are basically put in a log file so that if there's any error that comes up, the developer can easily debug that error. So basically guys, these are the main features of Spring Boot. That is Spring CLI, starter dependency, Spring Initializer, auto configuration, Spring Actuator, and logging and security. Now let's move on to the next question, that is explain how to create a Spring Boot application using Maven. Well, this is one of the basic questions that you can be asked in your interviews, that what are the different ways to basically create a Spring Boot application using Maven. Well, there are various approaches to create a Spring Boot application using Maven, but if I have to name a few, then the most common ones are the Spring Boot CLI, the Spring Starter Project Wizard, the Spring Initializer, and the Spring Maven project. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is what are the possible sources of external configuration, right? So there's no doubt in the fact that Spring Boot allows the developers to run the same application in different environments. Well, this is definitely done with the support it provides for the external configuration. So basically what happens is that Spring Boot uses environment variables, property files, and command line arguments, YAML files, and system properties to mention the required configuration properties. Also, the @value annotation is used to gain access to these properties, right? So if you ask me, the most possible sources of external configuration are the application properties, command line properties, and profile specific properties. Talking about application properties, by default, Spring Boot searches for the application properties file or its YAML file in the current directory, class path root, or the config directory to load the properties. Coming to command line properties, Spring Boot provides command line arguments and converts these arguments to the properties. And finally, it adds them to the set of environment properties. And finally, coming to profile specific properties, these properties are loaded from the application profile.properties file or its YAML file. So basically, this file resides in the same location as that of the non-specific property files, and the profile placeholder refers to an active profile. So if you ask me the most possible sources of external configuration, then it's application properties, command line properties, and profile specific properties. So that was about this question, guys. Moving on to the next question, that is, can you explain what happens in the background when a Spring Boot application is executed as run as Java application? So whenever a Spring Boot application is executed as run as Java application, it automatically launches the Tomcat server as soon as it sees a web application. So remember guys, whenever you're developing a web application and then you execute that particular project as a Java application, automatically the Tomcat server is launched. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the Spring Boot starters and what are the different starters provided by Spring Boot? Well, Spring Boot starters are basically a set of convenient dependency management providers which can be used in the application to enable different kinds of dependencies. So basically, these starters make development easy and rapid, and all the available starters come under the group org.springframework.boot. So if you ask me guys, what are Spring Boot starters, then just remember that the answer is really simple. They're basically a set of convenient dependency management providers which can be basically used to put in the application dependencies for your application. So whatever dependencies are required for the application, you can get it through the Spring Boot starters. Now the popular starters of Spring Boot are, as you can see on my screen. Well, it is the Spring Boot starter itself, the Spring Boot starter JDBC, the Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot starter data JPA, the Spring Boot starter security, the Spring Boot starter AOP, and the Spring Boot starter test. Talking about the Spring Boot starter first. Well, this is basically the core starter and it includes the logging, auto configuration support, and the YAML files. Coming to Spring Boot starter JDBC, this starter is basically used for hierarchy CP connection pool with JDBC. Coming to Spring Boot starter web, well, this starter is basically used for building web applications, including RESTful applications using Spring MVC. Talking about Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, this starter is basically used to use the Spring Data JPA with Hibernate. Coming to security, that is the Spring Boot Starter Security. This starter, as the name suggests, is basically used for the Spring security. Coming to the next one, that is Spring Boot Starter AOP. This starter is basically used for aspect-oriented programming with Aspect-J and Spring AOP. And finally, coming to Spring Boot Starter Test, this starter is basically used for testing Spring Boot applications. So guys, these are the few common starters that you need to know about when you attend interviews for a Java Spring Boot developer. Now moving on to the next question, that is what is Spring Actuator and what are its advantages? Well, Spring Actuator is basically a cool feature of Spring Boot with the help of which you can see what is happening inside a running application. So whenever you want to debug your application and you need to analyze the log, you basically have to understand what is happening in the application, right? So in such scenario, the Spring Actuator provides easy access to these features such as identifying beans, CPU usage, and many more. So you can just understand that, Spring Boot Actuator provides a very easy way to access the production-ready REST points and fetch all kinds of information from the web. Now, if you ask me how are these points secured? Well, these points are secured by using the Spring Security's content negotiation strategy. So that is what Spring Actuator is, guys. It's basically a feature with the help of which you can understand what is happening inside an application. Now moving on to the next question, that is what is Spring Boot Dependency Management? If someone asks you what is Spring Boot Dependency Management, then the answer is very simple, guys, that it is basically used to manage dependencies and configuration automatically without you specifying the version for any of that dependencies. So basically, whenever you want to include any dependency for your application, you don't have to mention the version of it. Automatically, the Spring Boot Dependency Management will figure out what version is required for the application and it will download that particular dependency for the application. So guys, that was about Spring Boot Dependency Management. Moving on to the next question, that is what are the minimum requirements to set up a Spring Boot system? Well guys, this is something very basic that you need to know when you're working on a Spring Boot environment. So for Spring Boot 2.1.7 release, you basically need Java 8 or more or the further versions of that. You need Spring Framework of 5.1.9 or even, higher versions of that. For explicit build support, you need Maven 3.3 version or even the further versions can work. Coming to Gradle, you need Gradle 4.4 version or more than that. And coming to servlet container support, you basically need Tomcat 9.0, Jetty 9.4 and Undertow 2.0. So guys, these are the basic requirements of a Spring Boot system. Let's move on with the next question, that is what is Timeleaf and how to use this Timeleaf? Well, Timeleaf is basically a server-side Java template engine used for web applications. It aims to bring natural template for your web application and can integrate well with Spring Framework and HTML Java web applications. So if you have to use Timeleaf, you basically have to add a dependency for Timeleaf. So the dependency code is as you can see on my screen. You have to basically add the group ID of all.springframework.boot and in the artifact ID, you have to add the starter project for Timeleaf, that is Spring Boot Starter Timeleaf, and everything should be inside the dependency tags. So if you have to understand Timeleaf, guys, it's really simple. It's basically a server-side Java template engine used for web applications. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is can we change the port of an embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Well, I would say yes. We can definitely change the port of an embedded Tomcat server by using the application.properties file. So basically in this file, you have to add a property known as server port and assign it to any port that you wish to. For example, if you want to assign it to 8081, then you have to mention server.port equal to 8081. Once you mention the port number, the application properties file will be automatically loaded by Spring Boot and the required configurations will be applied onto the application. So just remember that whenever you want to change the port of an embedded Tomcat server, you have to use this property of server.port and assign it to a new port. So let's move forward with the next question, that is what is the need for Spring Boot Dev Tools? Well, Spring Boot DevTools is basically an elaborated set of tools and aims to make the process of developing an application easier. So if the application runs in the production, then this module is automatically disabled and repackaging of archives is also excluded by default. The Spring Boot Developer Tools basically applies the properties to the respective development environments, and to include these dev tools, you have to again add the dependency that you can see on my screen. That is basically the group ID stands the same as that of the previous question for Timeleaf, that is org.springframework.boot, but in the artifact ID, you have to add spring-boot-dev-tools. So guys, that is what basically Spring Boot DevTools is. It's basically an elaborated set of tools and aims to make the process of developing an application easier. So now let's move forward with the next question, that is mention the steps to create a Spring Boot project using Spring Initializer. Now, this is something that, that is very basic to understand that, how do you actually start creating a project using Spring Initializer. But before I tell you how to create a project, let me just tell you that, Spring Initializer is basically a web tool provided by Spring Framework itself. So with the help of this tool, you can create a Spring Boot project by just providing the project details, right? So if you have to just create a Spring Boot project, what you have to do is you have to choose the Maven project and add the required dependencies. For example, you can add web, Jersey, H2, and so on. And then what you have to do is you have to fill other required details like, the group ID, the artifact, and then finally click on generate project. Once you think the project is downloaded, you have to extract the project onto your system, and then you have to import this project using the import option on the Spring Tool Suite ID. That is basically the STS ID through which you can use Spring Boot. But while importing the project, please remember that, you have to choose the project type to be Maven, and the source project should contain the pom.xml file, right? So just remember that, to create a Spring project using Spring Initializer, you first have to choose a Maven project and add the required dependencies. Then you have to mention other few details like, group ID, artifact ID, and so on. Once you're done with that, you'll just download that project, and then you'll just import that particular project onto your Spring Tool Suite ID, where you'll choose the pom.xml file. So guys, that was about Spring Initializer and how to create a project using the Spring Initializer. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the steps to connect a Spring Boot application to a database using JDBC? Well, the Spring Boot Starter project provides the required libraries to connect the application with JDBC. So for example, let's say you have to create an application and connect it with the MySQL database. What you have to do is you have to first create a database in MySQL, right? So to create a database in MySQL, you mention the command create database, and then you mention the database name. So for example, let's say I mention the database name to be example. Then after that, what you have to do is you have to create a table inside this particular database. To do that, you can just mention the command create table, and then you have to mention the table name. So over here, I'm mentioning it as customers, and then you have to mention the column names and the required data types, right? So if you see on my screen, what I had mentioned is basically customer ID. It's of int type, and then it is primary key. So when I say primary key, what I mean by that is, the table is uniquely identified with this particular column, right? And then it should be not null. That is basically no null value can be present in this particular table since it's a primary key, and it is auto incremented. After that, we also have the customer name. So customer name is of varchar type. That is basically any text till 255 characters. Now, once you're done with that, what you have to do is you have to next create a Spring Boot project and provide the required details, and finally add the JDBC, MySQL, and web dependencies to your project. Now, once the project is created, you have to configure the database into the application properties, right? So whenever you create a Spring Boot project, you'll see that, you'll have a file known as application properties. What you have to do is you have to configure your database to that application properties. To do that, what you do is you mention the code that you can see on my screen. So basically, you have to mention that, Spring Boot data source URL is basically MySQL localhost. That is basically you're defining that, you're connecting it to a MySQL database, and then you're mentioning the username to be root, password to be MySQL, and then you're enabling the spring.jpa.hibernate DDL to be create or drop. Now, once this is also done, what happens is that if you check your main application.java class, you'll basically have the code that you can see on my screen that, I've created a package, and then I've basically imported the required dependencies. And after that, I've just created a public class. And inside this public class, I've just created a run function. Now, once you check your application.java class, also, you have to next create a controller to handle the HTTP request by mentioning the code that you can see on my screen again, right? So basically over here, we've again imported the required annotations like request mapping, auto-wire, JDBC template, and REST controller, right? After that, I've just used the REST controller annotation, auto-wire, JDBC, and the request mapping annotation. And then over here, I've just given this command of insert, right? So what happens is that whenever this particular application is executed, the data that I mentioned over here in values is basically inserted into the table, right? So for example, I've mentioned the customer name to be Arya, right? So once this application is executed, and then you go to the port localhost :8080/insert, you'll see an output that, data entry is successful. And then you can again go forward and check into your MySQL database whether the data has been entered or not. So I hope, guys, that you've understood what are the steps to insert data into a MySQL database and connect a Spring Boot application with a database, right? Now, any interviewer won't ask you to sit and write a code for it. Well, I would just say he would just ask you the common steps or maybe a generalized view of how you can insert the data to make sure that, you have an understanding of Spring Boot or not. So on that note, let's look into the next question, that is how to enable the HTTP support in Spring Boot. Well, the answer to this question is really simple. You can just enable the HTTP support in Spring Boot by using this particular command that you can see on my screen, that is server.http2.enabled = true. So whenever you make it true, it is basically enabled. Next, let's look into the question, what are the differences between @request mapping and @rest controller annotation in Spring Boot? So the differences between these two annotations are really simple, guys. Well, the @request mapping annotation is basically used to provide the routing information and tells to Spring that any HTTP request must be mapped to a respective method. Also, to use this annotation, you have to import org.springframework.web.bind.annotation.request mapping. Coming to REST controller one, this annotation is basically used to add the response body and controller annotation to the class. So if you have to use this annotation, you basically have to import org.spring.framework.web.bind.annotation.rest controller. Now, if I have to explain you with an example, then you can see the example that I've mentioned on the screen. Right, so I've basically used the REST controller annotations and the request mapping annotations. So what I've done is in the request mapping one, I've mentioned /example, right? So when we open our URL, that is basically localhost.8080/example, only then we'll see a message that, return welcome to Edureka. So what happens is that, the example method that you can see over here, that is the string example method, is mapped to the example URL with the help of request mapping and REST controllers. Now moving on to the next question, that is what is Spring Boot CLI and how to execute the Spring Boot project using Boot CLI. Well, Spring Boot CLI is a tool supported by the official Spring framework. So the steps to basically execute a Spring Boot project are basically as you can see on my screen. You have to first download the CLI tool from the official website and extract the zip file. Then basically the bin folder present in the Spring setup is basically used to execute the Spring Boot application. After that, since Spring Boot CLI executes Groovy files, you need to create a Groovy file for Spring Boot application. So to do that, you have to open a terminal and change the current directory to a bin folder, and then you can open a Groovy file, right? If you have to start writing an application in Spring Boot CLI, please remember that that Spring Boot CLI supports Groovy files. So you have to go to the bin folder and then open a Groovy file, and then in the Groovy file, you can mention a controller as you can see on my screen. Right, so over here, as you can see, I've mentioned /example, and in H1, I've mentioned welcome to Edureka. That is basically what will be shown as output, right? After that, if you want to just execute this Groovy file, what you'll do is that, you'll mention this command of /spring run and then mention the name of the Groovy file. So since I had mentioned it as sample.groovy, I'll mention sample.groovy and semicolon. So guys, that was about what is Spring Boot CLI and how to execute a Spring Boot project using Spring Boot CLI. Let's move forward with the next question, that is what are the differences between JPA and Hibernate? Well, this is one of the most common questions that is asked in your Spring Boot interviews. Well, JPA is basically a data access abstraction which is used to reduce the amount of boilerplate code. Coming to Hibernate, Hibernate is an implementation of the Java Persistence API and offers benefit of loose coupling. So guys, these are the basic differences between JPA and Hibernate. So that was about the differences. The next question on the list is how can we create a custom endpoint in Spring Boot Actuator? Well, to create a custom endpoint in Spring Boot 2.x, you can basically use the @endpoint annotation. So Spring Boot basically exposes endpoints using @web endpoint annotation or @web endpoint extension over HTTP with the help of Spring MVC or Jersey. Let's move forward with the next question, that is what is Spring Data? Well, Spring Data aims to make it easy for the developers to use relational and non-relational databases, cloud-based data services, and other data access technologies. So basically, it makes it easy for data access and still retains the underlying data, right? So whenever you use Spring Data, remember that you're using it to connect with relational databases, non-relational databases, and other data access technologies. Let's move forward with the next question, that is what do you understand by auto configuration in Spring Boot and how to disable the auto configuration? So as the name suggests, auto configuration is basically used to automatically configure the required configuration for the application. For example, if you have a data source being present in the class path of the application, then it automatically configures the JDBC template. Alright, so with the help of this auto configuration, you can basically create a Java application in a very easy manner as it automatically configures the required beans and controllers. So to disable this auto configuration property, you basically have to exclude the attribute of @enable auto configuration annotation in the scenario where you don't want it to be applied, right? So what you have to basically mention is, as you can see on my screen, it's @enable auto configuration, and in brackets you mention exclude equal to data source auto configuration.class. Coming to the scenario, if the class is not on the class path, then you basically have to exclude the auto configuration by mentioning @enable auto configuration, and in brackets you'll mention exclude name equal to sample.class. Apart from this, Spring Boot also provides the facility to exclude the list of auto configuration classes by using the spring.autoconfigure.exclude property. So you can go forward and add it either into your application.properties file or add multiple classes with comma separated. So guys, that was about auto configuration and how you can disable. Auto configuration is basically used to automatically configure the required configuration, and to disable it, you just have to use the attribute name exclude. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the differences between Spring Boot application and enable auto configuration annotation? Talking about Spring Boot application annotation, first, it is basically used in the main class or the bootstrap class, and it is a combination of configuration, component scan, and enable auto configuration annotations. Coming to the enable auto configuration annotation, it is basically used to enable auto configuration and component scanning in your project, and is a combination of configuration and component scan annotations. So guys, these were the differences between Spring Boot application and enable auto configuration annotations. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the steps to deploy Spring Boot web applications as a jar and war files? Now to deploy Spring Boot web applications, you basically have to add a plugin in the pom.xml file. To add a plugin, you have to basically mention the code that you can see on my screen. That is that, you have to add the plugin tags, and then inside that tags, you have to add a group ID tags in which you'll mention org.springframework.boot, and in the artifact ID, you have to mention spring-boot-maven-plugin. So basically, guys, this is the plugin that you have to include. That is basically the Spring Boot Maven plugin. Now, by using the above plugin, you will basically get a jar file which executes the package phase. So this jar file will basically contain all the necessary libraries and dependencies required, and it will also contain an embedded server. So you can basically run the application like any other ordinary jar file, right? So if the packaging element in the pom.xml file must be sent to a jar, to build a jar, you'll basically mention packaging tags, and you'll mention jar inside that, as you can see on my screen. Similarly, to build a war file, you'll mention war inside the packaging tags. So guys, that was about how to deploy Spring Boot web application as a jar or a war file. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, can you give an example for read only as true in the transaction menu? Well, the example for read only as true in the transaction management could be as you can see on my screen. What you can answer is that, you can basically consider a scenario where you have to read data from database, right? For example, let's say you have a customer database, and then you want to read the customer details such as customer ID, name, and email ID. Now to do that, what you'll do is you'll basically set read only on the transaction, as we do not want to check the change in the entities. We just want to read the data from the database. So in such a scenario, you can basically use this read only as true in transaction management. So whenever you want to use database, guys, go forward with read only. If you want to look at the change in the entities, then you cannot use this. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, can you explain how to deploy a different server with Spring Boot? Well, to deploy a different server with Spring Boot, you basically have to follow two steps. The first step is to generate a war file from the project, and the second step is to basically deploy the war file onto your favorite server. Now, the steps to deploy the war file on the server is completely dependent on the server you choose, right? So the main steps to deploy a different server in the Spring Boot is to basically generate a war from the project, and then you have to deploy that particular war file onto your favorite server. Now, deploying it on the favorite server completely depends on server to server based, and there's not much difference in that, but yes, it depends on server to server based. Now let's look into the next question, that is, what is the best way to expose custom application configuration with Spring Boot? Now, there could be many ways, but one way to expose the custom application configuration in Spring Boot is by using the @value annotation. The only problem with this annotation is that, all the configuration values will be distributed throughout the application, right? Now, to avoid this, you can go forward with the centralized approach. By centralized approach, what I mean by that is that, you can define a configuration component using the @configuration properties, right? So you can define the @configuration properties, as you can see on my screen. What you can do is you can just use this configuration @configuration properties, and then you can mention whatever data that you want to mention. For example, let's say I mention example, right? And then I'll initialize few variables like, int num, boolean value, and string message. Now, according to the previous code, the values configured in the application properties will be example.number equal to 100, example.value equal to true, and example.message equal to dynamic message. So guys, that was about how you can expose a custom application configuration with Spring Boot. You can basically use a centralized approach instead of the @value annotation. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? Well, I would say we can definitely create a non-web application by removing the web dependencies from class path, along with changing the way Spring Boot creates the application context, right? So if you want to create a non-web application, what you have to do is you have to basically remove the dependencies from the class path, along with changing the way Spring Boot creates the application context. So guys, that was about how you can create a non-web application using Spring Boot. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the steps to connect an external database like MySQL or Oracle? Well, to connect an external database, you basically have to follow the steps that you can see on my screen. You'll start by adding the dependency for MySQL connected to the pom.xml file, and then you have to remove the h2 dependency from the pom.xml file. After that, you have to set up your MySQL database, and then you have to configure your connection to the MySQL database, and finally you can just restart your project. So guys, these were the steps to connect an external database like MySQL or Oracle. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, mention the advantages of YAML file than properties file and the different ways to load the YAML file in Spring Boot. Well, the advantages of a YAML file than a properties file is that, the data is stored in a hierarchical format. So it becomes very easy for the developers to debug if there's any issue, right? So the Spring application.class basically supports the YAML file as an alternative to properties whenever you use the Snake YAML library on your class part. So basic advantage of YAML file to properties file is that, the data is stored in a hierarchical format, and it becomes easy for the developers to debug if there's any error. Now, the different ways to load a YAML file in Spring Boot is basically by either using the YAML map factory bean to load the YAML as a map, or YAML properties factory bean to load the YAML as properties. Right? So guys, these are the basic two ways through which you can load the YAML file in Spring Boot. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, how is Hibernate chosen as the default implementation for JPA without any configuration? Well, when we use the Spring Boot auto configuration, automatically the Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency gets added to the pom.xml file. Since this dependency has a transitive dependency on JPA and Hibernate, Spring Boot automatically auto-configures Hibernate as the default implementation for JPA whenever it sees Hibernate in the class path. So guys, that is the reason that Hibernate is chosen as the default implementation for JPA. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, what do you understand by Spring Data REST? Well, as you know already what Spring Data is, Spring Data REST is basically used to expose RESTful services around Spring Data repositories, right? For example, let's say, you consider the example that you can see on my screen. Over here, I have a repository resource that, let's say, sample and the path to be sample again. And then it basically extends the customer repository with sample, and then, it has a few data. Now, to expose the REST services, you basically have to use the HTTP methods. And let's say, I use the post method. So in the post method, what happens is that, let's say I mentioned the customer name and customer email ID. So over here, let's say I mentioned Rohit and the customer email ID to be customer1@abc.com. And now what happens is that, in the response content, you automatically see that, the customer name comes to be Rohit. The customer email ID is customer1@abc.com. And then it has a local reference to the sample URL that you had just given. So if you observe the response content, then it contains the reference of the newly created resource, right? So that's how basically you can use the Spring Data REST, guys. It's basically used to expose the RESTful services around the Spring Data repositories. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what is the difference between request mapping and get mapping? Well, the difference is quite simple. The get mapping is basically a composed annotation that acts as a shortcut for request mapping method equal to request method.get. Right? So both these methods basically support the consumes. Now the consume options that are supported are the text plain and text plain application star. So both these consumes are supported by both the request mapping annotation and the get mapping annotation. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, in which layer should the boundary of the transaction start? Well, according to me, the boundary of the transaction should start from the service layer, since the logic for the business transaction is present in the layer itself. Let's move forward with the next question, that is, how does the path equal to sample and collection resource rel equal to sample work with Spring Data REST? Well, that is basically what you can see on my screen. That is, how is the collection resource rel equal to sample and path equal to sample work with Spring Data REST? So if you had just understood in my previous question about Spring Data REST, the path is basically a section which is used to mention the segment under which the resource is to be exported. And the collection resource is basically the value which is used to generate links to the collection resource. So guys, this is the basic difference. The path is basically used to mention the segment under which the resource is to be exported, and the collection resource is basically used to generate the links to the collection resource. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, explain how to register a custom auto configuration. So in order to register an auto configuration class, you have to mention the fully qualified name under the @enable auto configuration key meta-inf/spring factories file, right? Also, if you build with the Maven, then this file should be placed in the resources/meta-int directory. So that was about how to register a custom auto configuration. Let's move forward with the next question on how do you configure log4j for logging. Now, since Spring Boot supports log4j2 for logging a configuration, you have to exclude logback and include log4j2 for logging, and this can be only done by using the Spring Starters project. So to configure log4j for logging, you have to use the corresponding Starters project. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the differences between WAR and embedded containers? Well, WAR files basically benefit a considerable measure from the Spring Boot, and embedded containers are only one component of Spring Boot and is utilized during improvements, right? So WAR is basically used when you want benefit from Spring Boot, when you want to package a file as a WAR file, or maybe you are importing a file. And embedded containers is basically only one component of Spring Boot which is utilized during improvements. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what do you think is the need for profiles? Now, profiles in Spring basically provides a way to segregate the parts of the application configurations and makes it available in the environments. So basically, any component or any configuration annotation can be marked with profile to limit as it is loaded. Now, for example, let's say you have multiple environments, let's say dev, QA, stage, and prod. Now, let's say you want to have different application configurations in each of this environment. What you can do is you can use profiles to have different application configurations for each of these environments. So if you ask me the need of profiles, then I would say that profile is basically used in Spring and Spring Boot in such a way that you can determine or you can specify the active profile for a specific environment, and the configuration of the various environments can be set for various profiles, right? So different environments can have different kinds of configurations, right? So that's what you can do with profiles. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what are the steps to add a custom JS code with Spring Boot? Now the steps to add a custom JS code with Spring Boot are as you can see on my screen. You first have to create a folder called static under the resources folder, and then in this particular folder you can put the static content. So just in case the browser throws an unauthorized error that you're not allowed to do, you can either disable the security or search for the password in the log file and eventually pass it in the request header. So the steps to add custom JS code with Spring Boot is very simple. You have to create a folder called static under the resource folder, and then in this particular folder you have to add all the required static contents. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, how to instruct an auto configuration to back off when a bean exists. Now to instruct an auto configuration class to back off when a bean exists, you have to use the conditional on missing bean annotations, and the attributes for this annotation are basically value and name. The value basically stores the type of the beans to be checked, and the name basically stores the names of the beans to be checked. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, why Spring Data REST not recommended in real-world applications? Well, I would say Spring Data REST is not recommended in real-world applications as you're exposing your database entities directly as REST services. So while designing RESTful services, the two most important things that we consider is the domain model and the consumers, right? But if you use Spring Data REST, none of these parameters are considered as we are exposing our database entities as REST services. So I would just say you can use the Spring Data REST for initial evaluation of the project and then not use it in the further stages. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, what is the error you see if H2 is not present in the class path? Well, the error that you see is basically what you can see on my screen. It throws an error saying that cannot determine embedded database driver class for database type none. Now to resolve this type of error, you basically have to add the H2 dependency to the pom.xml file, and then you have to restart your server. Now to add this dependency, what you have to do is you have to mention the code that you can see on my screen. That is basically, again, under the dependency tags, you have to mention the group ID com.h2 database, and in the artifact ID, you have to mention h2. And in the scope, you'll mention runtime. Now talking about the next question, that is, what is the way to use profiles to configure the environment-specific configuration with Spring Boot? Now, since it's already a known fact that profile is nothing but a key to identify an environment, let's consider two profiles for this example. The first profile is dev, the second one is prod. Now let's say the properties that you can see on my screen are considered in the application.properties file, that is example.number to be 100, example.value to be true, and example.message to be dynamic message. Now say you want to customize the application.properties for the development profile, that is a dev profile. Then you need to create a file with the name application-dev.properties and override the properties that you want to customize. For example, let's say you want to override the properties of message, right? So in the example.message, you basically assign this value to dynamic message in dev. Similarly, if you want to customize the application.properties for the prod profile, then you again have to create a file with the name application-prod.properties and override the properties that you want to customize. So again, we can just mention example.message, dynamic message and prod. Once you're done with profile specific configuration, what you have to do is you have to set the active profile in an environment. So to do that, either you can use -d spring.profiles.active equal to prod in arguments, or you can use spring.profiles.active equal to prod in application.properties file. So guys, that was about how you can use profiles to configure the environment specific configuration with Spring Boot. Let's move forward with the next question, that is mention the dependencies needed to start up a JPA application and connect in memory database H2 with Spring Boot. Well, the dependencies to start a JPA application and connect in memory database with H2 in Spring Boot, you basically need three dependencies, that is web starter, H2 and data JPA starter. So to include these dependencies, you basically have to include the Spring Starter projects of all the three. That is that, for web starter, you'll include Spring Boot Starter Web. For H2, you'll include com.h2 database and then in the artifact ID H2. And for data JPA starter, you'll basically include Spring Boot Starter data JPA. So these are the basic dependencies that are required, that is web starter, H2 and data JPA starter. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is what do you understand by Spring Boot supports relaxed binding? Well, relaxed binding is a way in which the property name does not need to match the key of the environment property. In Spring Boot, relaxed binding is applicable to the type-safe binding of the configuration properties. For example, if a property in a bean class with the added configuration properties annotation is used sample prop, then it can be bounded to any of the properties like, sample prop in lowercase, sample prop in uppercase, sample-prop, and even sample-prop in uppercase. So basically, relaxed binding is basically a way in which the property name does not have to match the key of the environment property, right? So that's what you have to understand, that, when I say Spring Boot supports relaxed binding. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is, where is the database connection information specified and how does it automatically connect to H2? Well, the answer to this question is very simple. It is because of the Spring Boot auto configuration property that configures the dependencies of the application. So the database connection information and automatically connecting the database to H2 is completely done by the auto configuration property. Now let's move forward with the next question, that is what is the name of the default H2 database configured by Spring Boot? Well, the name of the default H2 database is the testDB. So if you check for the default database name, then you'll see that spring.datasource.name equal to testDB. Now, just in case if you're using H2 in memory database, then exactly this is the name of the Spring Boot which is used to set up your H2 database also, right? So that is what basically is, guys, the name of the default H2 database is testDB. Now coming to the final question for today's session, that is, do you think you can use Jetty instead of Tomcat in Spring Boot Starter Web? Well, I would say yes, we can definitely use Jetty instead of Tomcat in Spring Boot Starter Web by removing the existing dependencies, and then you just have to include the dependency for Spring Boot Starter Jetty. To exclude the dependencies, that is the existing one, you have to use the exclusion tag that you can see in my screen. You can just use the Spring Boot Starter Web dependency and the Jetty dependency. Right, so guys, with this we come to an end of this particular session. I hope you found this session informative and I hope all the questions were clear to you. So if you have attended any interviews regarding Java developer or Spring Boot Java developer and you have any questions, please comment them in the comment section and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until then, that's all from my side today. I hope you found this session interesting, so thank you and have a great day.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!